In one of many institutional definitions associated with Gordon, again perhaps falsely, is the claim that the university system is little more than an institution in which professionally trained idiots induct other professionally trained idiots into the habits of identifying professionally trained idiocy in their peers. Or, in its shorter iteration, an organization of idiots trained to spot idiots. Undoubtedly simplistic, this definition of university life might nonetheless be added to the Gordonalia. Notoriously, the university bred more than its quota of regurgitative specialists, experts in fossilized vomit, who were said to owe their classificatory terminology to a passing comment Gordon once made. The specialists were stood by a fossil lump they had recently acquired. Having glanced the crinoid stems, all messed up and overlaid, Gordon likened the stone vomit to the so-called cut-up technique. To be classified as vomit, a specimen must contain the stems of at least 2 different species of sea lily, they said, cut up, and mashed about, so that it forms a new text. In a parallel intervention, a research group within the, now defunct, sociology department borrowed its terminology from the paleontologists. Or from Gordon masquerading as a paleontologist. This seems more likely. They had no other contact with the faculty of science at that point, and the university had yet to fully amalgamate. The sociologists found a short tract on Mesozoic deadfalls on a chair Gordon had recently vacated. The typescript was crumpled, so they said, as if Gordon had been sitting on the thing for some time before finally raising himself up and leaving. The sociologists did not much speculate on why Gordon was sitting on the wad of typescript in the first place, and thereby imprinted it, in that manner, with his blunt posterior. They were more struck by the likeness between Gordon's tract and a subsequent publication. This subsequent paper, which they called the derivative paper, would not be published for another 20 or 30 years and would come out under an adjusted title and a long list of authors. None of whom would be Gordon. His own contribution would be erased, as was typical, and the origins of yet another scientific advance in Gordon's own thinking, abstruse as it will have been, were again forgotten. The sociologists who did not quite forget, but struggled in their own way to recall specifics, were reminded in their dotage of Gordon's contribution to science. They remembered Gordon as they later came across the paper in question, and as they passed this recently published report from one retirement home to the next. We were working within a living corpse, the sociologist said. Our institution had become a corpse and we needed a way to conceptualize the corpse life we were already confined to, back then, and which has only become worse since our retirement. We thought we were in one of its dead spaces, they continued, everything around us seemingly already dead, but we could not ignore our own continued movements in the dead space of the university and the movements of others, and so needed a way of thinking how a dead space, or a space of death, or a still living space which felt heavy with death, might still be alive, even profligate at times. And when we saw our professors dance as professors now dance, we needed a way of understanding that. Gordon had already anticipated this need for a conceptualization device, and Gordon prefigured as an after effect of his thinking certain advances in paleontology too, they said. Paleontology only benefited, as it did, by an accidental effect of the conceptualization device that Gordon clearly bequeathed us and that Gordon intended for us, so that we could understand why we felt heavy with death, and why the professors still danced. Gordon supplied a way of thinking contemporary corpse life just as he supplied a way of thinking Mesozoic corpse life, having figured fathoms deep deadfall events before the first submarine to find the first deadfall whale did indeed find that whale. This whale was the first known corpse descender, run across by mere accident at 4,000 feet, or 666 fathoms, in the late 80s. As the biologists of the day described with more enthusiasm than allowed by their scientific credentials, 2,000 years of ordinary oceanic snow would be needed to fill the same patch of seabed with the same nutriment that a 40-ton whale might deliver in a moment. It was a gift to the seabed, and all the crawling creatures, and the swimmers too, coming from distances that could be crawled, or drifted, or swam, would assemble, and had already nibbled a good amount, and would keep nibbling and tearing at and infesting the tissues for so much longer than we have the resources to watch. We do not have the resources to watch, the biologists already lamented. These biologists envisaged how the eager creatures gathered from the murk. We shall need greater funds, they said as the submarine returned to the surface. We shall need millions so that we can keep returning to that corpse to witness its disintegration and nutriment effects. Gordon had already as good as seen the crawling and the infesting and the tearing to pieces, or if he had not quite seen these precise creatures or would not know them if he did, Gordon would have seen by intuition how the corpse life would conduct itself, and how the death of large things must be followed through by the littler things that live in and around them, and then by the slightly bigger things, the human seeing things and their verbal engines. So it was Gordon provided the conceptual apparatus to conceptualize this deadfall environment before anyone had studied or even glimpsed these sunken whales in his time. And, in any case, by the time they glimpsed them, most of the deadfall environment these biologists had just discovered and made available to science was itself dead. A whole cluster of extinctions in the uglier order of species had already long passed. The extinction of these uglier lifeforms, carcass specialists evolved over millions of years, was as certain, these scientists now felt, as it had to remain a matter of pure speculation. Gordon anticipated both the Mesozoic deadfall and the contemporary deadfall, and then the virtual extinction of most deadfall specialist scavengers that had been picking over corpses for millions of years, and the bone suckers and bone borers, specialist mollusks and other worms, bone dust-eating snails, and novel species of tube worm like those still remaining. When it came to corpse life, Gordon anticipated its human attendants too. We should have known them in their particulars before they took their particulars on or became them, the sociologist said. In human communities, bit-piece pickers might have similarly ancient precursors and similarly ugly habits, and with each civilizational collapse these specialists in dismemberment might have returned to the heights of their activity, and there may, indeed, be an untold history of these institutional disassemblers, and the complex systems of colonization and metabolization they spawned. The use of stone from a Roman villa in a medieval church is really nothing but a trace of their work. That the same limestone used to build these Roman villas was subsequently quarried 2,000 years later by geologists whose findings were presented in the paper on Mesozoic deadfalls, is nothing but an indicator of a shared greed. Our own corpse life is not particularly distinct, they said, thinking of the ruins of their university, or if it is different, it might owe many of its activities to older habits acquired over the deadfall events of historic time. The opportunistic, crab-like movements of colleagues at work may be ancient reflexes, distantly acquired motions, which merely required the right conditions to re-emerge and would only appear, with such preponderance, in events such as this. The corpse life of a present-day university worker may well reinvest the habits of past bit-piece pickers from past civilizational collapses, and the modern university might merely be the latest corpse. The sociologists in question recognized that during its 900-year emergence from medieval to modern institution, with medieval vestiges and vestments, the university had accumulated a considerable legacy of material, nutriments of a sort, and these would produce mass spawn events in the years of its final decay and decomposition. The successions would be diverse in their taxonomic composition and would represent islands of activity and abundance at their high points. Each spawn would be a simulation of intellectual ferment, they felt, and could be nothing more in the dead zone it would inhabit. The professors would do their dance, but it would merely be another spawn event, and another exhibit of corpse life. These occasional upsurges which resembled intellectual activity without being remotely intellectual, would occur in the midst of desert space, the city space, in the district of wider intellectual dead zones which were to fall or had already descended upon the city and city life and its attendant media, both printed and electrified, or in the context of that dead zone one theorist among them called, the stupefaction of public life. Or so much the sociology research group claimed. Having no investment themselves in the city and the city life they presumed dead. These sociologists merely grazed in its superior coffee houses and disregarded the rest. They had no real knowledge of its thinking life and thinking health, and assumed, probably not without purchase on reality, that the thinking life of the city was just as dead, or ailing, as the thinking life of its university, and so they condemned it too. Their outlook would have been considered bold at the time, although their analysis has since come to appear obvious as it relates to the death of so-called higher education which is now laid fairly low. Their university had already spent years in the pre-deadfall phase, the floating and bloating period, during which multiple surface-level scavengers had nibbled and distended its corpse. In its bloating years, weaker anatomical units, fins, heads, tails, became detached and drifted away just as various parasites attempted to anchor themselves on and affix themselves into the blubber. The weaker anatomical units of the original corpse, those parts released in the initial phase of corpse life, these might become deadfalls too, but they would descend far from the main body and would produce less active zones of decay and dismemberment. They fell elsewhere in the city and vanished quickly. The university then and thereafter, or the residual bulk of it, took the form or the habits of a large sunken carcass, a reeking lump in the middle of an otherwise dead cityscape of deadened living. There were still little upsurges of necrotic-driven activity to be had and to delight in, residual and derivative as they might nonetheless be. Mobile scavenging communities, such as they hoped to become, might only hope to stray to another corpse in a slightly better condition. If they could make it and make it through the community of bit-piece pickers, the other corpse would have likely already assembled. So much for their analogy, which was their terminology. The research group soon dispersed. Evidently, the sociologists required further impetus to turn the little script Gordon left on his chair into an operational variable, and this impetus was never forthcoming.